In the heat and aridity of ancient Egypt, human DNA seldom survives. For decades, the genetic story of Egypt's earliest dynasties remained tantalizingly out of reach, until a remarkable breakthrough. You'll meet NUE-001, a man who lived nearly 4,800 years ago at the dawn of Egypt's Old Kingdom. His body lay undisturbed in a sealed ceramic pot, hidden in a cliffside tomb, an unlikely time capsule. From a single tooth, scientists have now unlocked his complete genome. His DNA reveals a surprising tale. Roughly 80% of his ancestry ties him to North African Neolithic populations, while 20% traces back to Mesopotamia, offering the first direct genetic glimpse into ancient cross-continental connections. Though he may have been a humble potter by trade, his preserved remains speak volumes about migration, exchange, and the forging of one of history's most iconic civilizations. High above the floodplains of the Nile, where cliffs rise sharply from the desert edge, a small rock-cut tomb once held the remains of a man whose story would only come to light nearly 5 millennia later. Archaeologists working in the Fayum region uncovered his burial in a most unusual setting. Not a coffin, not a shroud, but a large ceramic vessel, sealed tightly and tucked away within the tomb chamber. Inside lay the skeleton of a middle-aged man, carefully placed in a fetal position, as if folded into the clay jar. This style of burial was not typical of the Old Kingdom elite. It suggested that the man, later catalogued as NUE-001, was of more modest means, perhaps part of the vast working population who sustained Egypt's early dynasties. His skeletal remains bore the wear of physical labor, signs of a life shaped by repetitive tasks, possibly pottery itself, hinting at the poetic symmetry of a potter interred within his own craft. Yet what made this discovery extraordinary was not the burial practice, but the state of preservation. The sealed environment of the jar created conditions hostile to decay and microbial activity. In Egypt's hot, arid climate, DNA rarely survives intact. Most ancient remains yield only fragments, if anything at all. But in this case, the combination of desert dryness and the airtight clay vessel had protected genetic material for thousands of years. When researchers extracted a single tooth, they found something astonishing. Not just degraded traces of DNA, but a complete, analyzable genome. For the first time, scientists could reconstruct the full genetic profile of an ancient Egyptian individual, something long thought nearly impossible. What had begun as an unassuming burial in a pottery jar had now transformed into one of the most significant breakthroughs in the study of ancient Egypt. Through NUE-001, we are offered a direct biological connection to the people who built the foundations of Egyptian civilization. To understand the significance of NUE-001's DNA, we need to step back into the world he inhabited, Egypt at the dawn of the Old Kingdom. Around 2850 BCE, the Nile Valley was entering one of the most transformative phases in its history. The scattered communities of the pre-dynastic period had already coalesced into a unified state a few centuries earlier, but the early dynasties were still laying down the cultural and political foundations that would define Egypt for millennia. This was the time of the Third and Fourth dynasties, when rulers began commissioning the first large-scale stone monuments. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara had already risen, a symbol of centralized authority and divine kingship. Soon after, the colossal pyramids of Giza would dominate the horizon. Yet behind the grandeur of kings and monumental architecture lay the ordinary lives of artisans, farmers, and laborers, people like NUE-001. Egypt's power rested on the annual flooding of the Nile, which provided fertile soil for agriculture. Villages clustered along the riverbanks, growing barley, emmer wheat, and flax. Communities were also deeply connected through craft industries, especially pottery, which played an essential role in storage, food preparation, and ritual. Skilled potters, though not wealthy, occupied an important place in society, supplying households and temples alike. It was also a period of increasing interaction with neighboring regions. Trade networks extended eastward into the Sinai and Levant, and southward into Nubia. Goods, ideas, and people were moving across boundaries. The genetic signal later found in NUE-001, partly North African, partly Mesopotamian, reflects this wider pattern of contact. Egypt was not isolated. It was already participating in the early currents of interregional exchange that shaped the ancient world. Thus, NUE-001 lived at a pivotal moment. Within a state consolidating its political might, expanding its monuments, and deepening its connections with other lands. His life may not have left inscriptions or grand tombs, but through his preserved DNA, we glimpse the broader story of Egypt's emergence as a civilization. For decades, one of the greatest challenges in studying ancient Egypt has been the scarcity of genetic material. The hot, arid climate, combined with traditional burial practices, tends to destroy DNA within just a few centuries. Earlier attempts to sequence ancient Egyptian genomes often produced only partial results, usually contaminated by modern DNA introduced during excavation or handling. Scholars debated whether a complete genome could ever be recovered from Egyptian remains. This is why NUE-001 represents such a remarkable turning point. Encased in his sealed pottery vessel, his body had been shielded from many of the destructive forces that normally degrade DNA. When researchers extracted a tooth, they were astonished to find that it preserved enough intact material to reconstruct his genome in its entirety. Not just fragments, but the whole genetic blueprint of a man who lived nearly 5,000 years ago. The work required cutting-edge methods. Scientists first ground a section of the tooth to powder, releasing minute traces of DNA locked within the dense enamel and dentin. Using advanced sequencing technology, they then pieced together millions of fragments into a coherent genome. Extreme precautions were taken to minimize contamination. Clean room facilities, sterilized equipment, and rigorous comparison against the genetic signatures of everyone involved in the study. The result was the first complete genome from ancient Egypt, published in Nature in 2025. This breakthrough did more than add a single data point to the field. It demonstrated that with the right conditions and techniques, full genetic reconstructions from Egypt are possible. What had once been thought nearly unattainable suddenly became a new frontier for archaeology and genetics. The significance goes beyond the technical feat. A complete genome offers far more detail than partial sequences, allowing scientists to explore ancestry, population dynamics, even hints of health and disease. In NUE-001's case, his DNA would reveal a blend of origins that rewrites aspects of how we think about Egypt's earliest dynasties and their connections to the wider world. When scientists analyzed NUE-001's genome, they uncovered a story that was far more complex than a simple picture of ancient Egyptian identity. His DNA pointed to a blend of origins that illuminated the diverse currents flowing into the Nile Valley during the Old Kingdom. The majority of his ancestry, around 80%, was linked to North African Neolithic populations, particularly those from what is today Morocco. These groups, thriving thousands of years earlier, had been part of a wave of farming communities that spread across North Africa, carrying new technologies, crops, and ways of life. NUE-001's strong genetic ties to them show that Egypt's population in the Pyramid Age still carried deep local roots, grounded in the broader North African cultural sphere. But there was another layer. Approximately 20% of his genetic profile traced back to populations in the Eastern Fertile Crescent, stretching across Mesopotamia. This was striking because it suggested a tangible biological link between Egypt and the cradle of civilization to the east. While archaeological evidence had long shown that Egypt interacted with its neighbors through trade and exchange, this genome provided direct proof that such contact extended to the movement of people themselves. The implications are significant. Mesopotamia was already a center of urban life, writing, and complex economies by the 3rd millennium BCE. Its connections with Egypt were not only material, but also human, involving migration or intermarriage that left genetic traces in the population. NUE-001's ancestry shows that even someone of modest status in Egypt could carry a heritage shaped by these far-reaching connections. At the same time, the predominance of North African ancestry underscores that Egypt's identity was never solely imported or defined by outsiders. The civilization that built the pyramids emerged from a deeply local foundation, yet it was open to influences from abroad. NUE-001's DNA, therefore, captures both continuity and contact, the enduring presence of North African farmers and the threads of exchange that tied Egypt into the wider ancient world. The genetic makeup of NUE-001 adds weight to what archaeology has long suggested. Ancient Egypt was both rooted in its own land and shaped by connections across regions. The Nile Valley, while geographically bounded by deserts on either side, was never an isolated world. Its river served as a highway of exchange, and its position at the crossroads of Africa and the Near East made it a meeting ground of cultures. The strong North African component in NUE-001's ancestry reflects the long continuity of communities that had lived and farmed in the region for millennia. This local foundation explains why Egyptian culture developed such a distinctive character, deeply tied to the rhythms of the Nile and agricultural traditions unique to its environment. Yet, the Mesopotamian influence within his DNA reminds us that external contacts were shaping Egypt even at this early stage. How such influences arrived is a matter of interpretation. The Mesopotamian connection could reflect small-scale migrations of individuals or families, perhaps artisans, traders, or administrators moving into Egypt. It might also represent more gradual, long-term mixing through generations of contact between Egypt and the Levant, a known corridor for movement and exchange. Either way, it reveals that Egypt's population was not closed, but porous, absorbing new elements over time. This blending of ancestries had broader cultural implications. Egypt was already adopting and adapting ideas from its neighbors. Cylinder seals, architectural concepts, and even certain administrative practices show parallels with Mesopotamia. The genetic evidence suggests that such exchanges were not only intellectual or material, but also biological. People themselves were part of the traffic of innovation and cultural flow. For scholars, this challenges older narratives that saw Egypt as a purely insular civilization, developing in splendid isolation. Instead, the picture is more dynamic. A society deeply local, yet also part of wider currents of migration and influence. NUE-001's genome provides a biological anchor for this understanding, showing that the very individuals who lived and worked during the Pyramid Age embodied both Egypt's native heritage and its links to the broader ancient world. Behind the genetic data, NUE-001 was still a person who lived, worked, and eventually died in Old Kingdom Egypt. His skeleton offers clues about his daily life and social standing. Osteological analysis shows he was a middle-aged man, likely in his late 30s or early 40s at the time of death, a respectable age in an era when many did not live beyond their 20s. His bones bore the marks of physical labor. Patterns of wear in his spine and joints suggest repetitive movements, the kind associated with craft or manual work. Archaeologists propose that he may have been a potter, which creates a poignant symmetry, a potter buried within a clay vessel, his craft enclosing him for eternity. Whether this was deliberate symbolism or simply a practical choice is unknown, but it highlights the social roles of skilled laborers in sustaining Egyptian life. The burial itself offers insights into his status. Unlike the stone-cut tombs and lavish grave goods of the elite, his interment was modest. A large ceramic jar was his coffin, placed in a cliffside tomb with little in the way of ornamentation. This aligns with the lives of non-elite Egyptians, those who built the infrastructure of the kingdom, supplied its households, and labored in its workshops. They formed the majority of the population, yet rarely left behind inscriptions or records of their names. NUE-001 stands as one of the few direct representatives of this silent majority. Even without written testimony, his remains tell us about his world. He lived at a time when monumental projects like the pyramids were underway, likely witnessing the mobilization of vast labor forces. He was part of a society structured by both hierarchy and communal effort, where skilled workers provided essential goods for the functioning of the state and the temple economy. Through NUE-001, history gains not just a genetic sequence, but a glimpse into the lived reality of an ordinary Egyptian. His story bridges the gap between anonymous laborers of the past and the grand narrative of kings and monuments, reminding us that civilization was built as much by hands like his as by the rulers who claimed its glory. The successful sequencing of NUE-001's genome is more than the story of a single individual. It reshapes how scholars approach the study of ancient Egypt and its place in world history. For decades, debates about Egyptian origins were shaped largely by archaeology, linguistics, and art. DNA was expected to play only a limited role, since the climate seemed too harsh for long-term preservation. The breakthrough with NUE-001 overturns that assumption. It proves that with careful excavation and new technology, it is possible to recover high-quality genomes even from the Nile Valley. This opens a path to addressing long-standing questions. How did populations move into and out of Egypt over the centuries? To what extent did foreign influence leave a biological mark? And how did it shape the Egyptian identity we know from texts and monuments? And UE001 provides one answer. Egypt was both grounded in its African roots and connected through the movement of people from abroad. Future genomes may reveal how this balance shifted across dynasties through invasions, trade, and cultural exchange. The discovery also highlights the value of studying non-elite burials. For years, most of what we knew about ancient Egypt came from royal tombs and monumental sites, giving a skewed view focused on kings and elites. NUE001 reminds us that the majority population, the farmers, artisans, and laborers, were the backbone of the civilization. Their lives are harder to trace in texts, but their DNA offers direct testimony. Moreover, this research contributes to the wider study of human history. Egypt, positioned between Africa, the Levant, and the Mediterranean, was a corridor of interaction. Understanding its genetic history provides clues about broader patterns of migration and cultural transmission in the ancient world. In this sense, NUE001 is not just an Egyptian story, but part of the global narrative of how human populations moved, mixed, and created new forms of society. By sequencing his genome, science has effectively given voice to someone who would otherwise remain anonymous. His remains now speak not only for himself, but for countless others whose contributions shaped one of history's greatest civilizations. The sequencing of NUE001's genome marks a milestone, but it is only the beginning. As groundbreaking as this achievement is, it represents just one individual, a single life frozen in time. While his DNA offers unprecedented insight, it cannot by itself define the genetic landscape of an entire civilization. The challenge now is to expand this research to other burials across Egypt's vast timeline from the pre-dynastic era through the later dynasties. Researchers are cautious about generalizing from a single case. NUE001 lived during the Old Kingdom, but Egypt's history spans more than 3,000 years, marked by shifting political borders, foreign invasions, and long-distance trade. Each period may reveal different genetic signatures. Sequencing additional genomes could show whether NUE001's Mesopotamian ancestry was unusual or part of a broader pattern of population movement. Future discoveries will also depend on finding remains preserved under similarly favorable conditions. The sealed pottery vessel that protected NUE001 was a rare stroke of luck. Scientists now know what to look for: tightly sealed environments, teeth and petrous bones, and burial contexts that minimize contamination. Advances in sequencing technology will further improve the ability to recover usable DNA, even from degraded samples. Beyond Egypt itself, the implications extend to neighboring regions. By comparing ancient genomes across Africa and the Near East, researchers can trace the roots of migration and exchange that shaped early civilizations. Egypt's role as a crossroads makes it especially valuable in mapping out these patterns. There is also a broader cultural dimension. Studies like this can help move the public discussion of Egypt's origins away from outdated, politicized debates and toward a clearer picture grounded in science. Instead of framing Egypt as belonging exclusively to one heritage or another, genetics shows it was both deeply African and globally connected. NUE001, a man of modest means, has thus become a symbol of what future research may uncover: the human diversity that underpinned Egypt's greatness. His genome is not an endpoint, but an opening chapter in a much larger story that scientists are only beginning to tell. The story of NUE001 is at once intimate and far-reaching. From a single tooth, carefully preserved inside a clay jar, scientists have reconstructed not only the genetic identity of one man, but also a new chapter in our understanding of ancient Egypt. His genome reveals a civilization deeply anchored in its North African roots, yet open to connections that stretched as far as Mesopotamia. In his very DNA, we see evidence of how Egypt stood at the crossroads of continents, absorbing influences while forging a culture uniquely its own. For centuries, the voices of ordinary Egyptians have been drowned out by the monumental presence of kings, pyramids, and temples. NUE001 shifts that focus. He was not a ruler, priest, or general, but likely a craftsman, a potter whose daily labor left no inscription. And yet, through the lens of modern science, his remains now speak more clearly than many pharaohs' tombs. They remind us that history is built not only by elites, but by the countless individuals whose lives sustain the great structures of civilization. This first complete genome from ancient Egypt is a beginning rather than an end. As more discoveries follow, we may come to see the genetic mosaic of ancient Egypt with far greater clarity, tracing the movements of people, the mingling of cultures, and the resilience of communities across centuries. NUE 001's legacy is not only his own story, but the promise of countless others waiting to be uncovered in the sands of the Nile Valley.